Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of HeebieJeebies TV. Now, today's episode is going to be a very interesting one, and it's probably one that a lot of you have not heard of and probably didn't even know it actually had a movie based on it. But before we get into that, I just want to send a quick reminder to please consider subscribing if you enjoy this type of content. We post 2 to 3 times a week, and we like to talk about stuff like paranormal, true crime, and unsolved mysteries. Okay, so let's get into today's story. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, if not, definitely have heard of the movie The Hills Have Eyes. There was, I think, 2 or 3 movies made of this franchise. And if you don't know what it's about, basically it's about a group of people that are living in the desert in the United States, very isolated, very remote area. And basically, they are the subject of human experiments, radiation, kind of like what would happen to you if there were humans still living in Chernobyl. Because they have been experimented on so much, they've become mutated and really unhuman like. And so, because of that, they're so isolated, they actually end up preying on humans. They basically become cannibals because they have so few limited resources. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but The Hills Have Eyes is actually based on a true story that took place in Scotland in the 15th and 16th centuries. Let's go back to the beginning so you guys can get a better understanding of what happened. So, like I said earlier, this story takes us back to Scotland, specifically to an area called Lothian, between the 1500s and the 1600s, when a man or a child named Alex Bean was born. So Alex was born into a fairly poor family. His father was a ditch digger, and growing up in that sort of environment, it was kind of expected for him to follow in his father's footsteps and to also take up the trade. Unfortunately, as Alex was growing up, this did not work out for him. He didn't enjoy it. He wasn't even good at it and kind of just gave up on following his dad's footsteps of being a ditch digger. So around this time, he actually met a woman called Black Agnes Douglas. And there were rumors that this woman was actually evil and even suspected to have been a witch. And together they fell in love and actually decided to run away together. So they decided to run away to an area called Ballintraw along the Ayrshire coast, specifically in a cave called Benain or Benan. I'm not exactly sure the pronunciation, but they decided to run away to this cave that actually still exists today. So it's reported that this cave is actually a lot bigger than it seems. So when you look at it from the outside, it looks just like a big mountain with a small opening at the bottom. But you would never guess that on the inside, it actually goes deep, about 200 yards. Not only was this cave 200 yards deep, but the entrance was actually covered by the ocean, by the seawater during high tide. So this is actually what helped the family go undetected for over 25 years. So whenever the tide would rise up to a certain point, it would seal the cave and the bottom part of the cave would be covered in water. But as we'll get into the story later, you'll find out how the family was able to remain undetected for so long. So initially, Alex and this witch woman, Agnes, lived off of the land. Eventually, they decided to turn towards a life of crime. So because the cave was in a fairly isolated area, there weren't a lot of people around, but every now and then there would be someone walking along the beach or there would be someone traveling through the area. And Alex and Agnes took this opportunity to rob people. At first, it was just about robbing them, seeing what kind of goods they had on them. But one day, they decided to do something different. They actually decided to cannibalize their first human. So what would happen is that they would kind of set up a small ambush between the two of them. And whenever this person was not expecting it, they would attack them and then kill them. And then Alex was actually said to have been the one responsible for dragging their bodies into the cave and then chopping them up into tiny little pieces. It's also reported that they actually went as far as to finding some old wooden barrels and using them to pickle human body parts so they could extend basically the shelf life of the human meat so they could have food for longer periods of time. So eventually, Alex and Agnes decide to have a family. And this ended up being a fairly large family. They actually had 8 boys and 6 girls, so 14 children altogether. And because they were so isolated, they didn't have any contact with the outside world. Their children, as they were growing up, started having relations with each other and even with the parents as well. So inbreeding resulted in a lot more children. This actually led to the family expanding, and they ended up having 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters. So, with so many people now part of their family, the amount of food they needed also went up drastically. Now, it's estimated over 25 years that Alex and his family actually ambushed, attacked, and murdered approximately, if not more than 1,000 people. Part of their tactics including setting up, obviously, the attack in the middle of the night whenever this person would be alone. They would attack them, they would bring them into the cave, chop them up, and then they would dispose of body parts by throwing them in the ocean. And then this would actually result in body parts washing up on beaches across the area, across the country. And then people would just assume that these body parts were byproducts of animal attacks on people. So with so many people missing, obviously the surrounding towns started to get uncomfortable and they started to notice that a lot of people were missing. They were not finding these people. So they started to become quite suspicious. So the townspeople put together their own search party and they started looking around the area. They had even come close to the cave and they had spotted the cave where the family was hiding. But because it was so remote and isolated, they kind of brushed it off. They didn't think that any sort of human life could survive living in a cave, so they didn't even bother searching inside of it. When the townspeople went back to their villages, their towns, they were all still very confused. They were scared. They were paranoid about what was happening. So much so that it drove them to wrongly accuse several people of these crimes. And actually, they ended up wrongly killing several people because of this. So it wasn't until one day when a man and his wife were actually coming home from a fair. They were riding their horses together along the beach when they were attacked by Alex and his family. Unfortunately, they went for the wife first. They grabbed her from the horse. They pulled her off, immediately slit her throat. They disemboweled her and started literally eating her on the beach as her husband watched and screamed in horror. And as they were going to attack him next, a group of approximately 30 people came over the hill. They were also coming home from the fair and were able to scare away Alex and his family. So this event obviously did not go unnoticed. People were horrified about what they had seen, especially the woman's husband. So they all band together. They all went to Glasgow to report the incident to the government and even to the king. It was believed that the king at the time was King James VI, and he decided to actually set up a large-scale manhunt for these people. It's actually said that he brought together 400 of his best men and several bloodhounds to start and lead this search. So as they are searching the area, the bloodhounds actually picked up on a scent and they went straight for the cave. Now, initially, the men were a little bit skeptical. They thought that maybe the dogs were detecting previous attacks, that it wasn't actually in the cave. But regardless, they decided to trust the dogs and follow them towards the cave. So they go inside, and initially, they don't see anything. It's just dark. There's nothing there. But the dogs kept insisting. They kept pulling. They kept barking. And so they decided to follow the dogs. And that's when they discovered Alex and his family. And the scene they saw was said to be so gruesome and disgusting that it traumatized these people for the rest of their lives. So inside the cave was Alex and his family, completely surrounded by chopped up body parts. There were said to be body parts hanging from the walls, from, I guess, what you would call the ceiling, almost like you were in a butcher shop. There were also barrels with pickled human remains and several piles of jewelry and stolen goods from all their victims. From here, the family was arrested and actually taken to Edinburgh for trial. People in Edinburgh didn't really consider them to be humans. The way they were living, the sort of acts they had committed, they were actually classified as subhuman, and because of this, they were actually denied a trial. what happened instead is that the men of the family actually had their hands and their legs chopped off so they could basically bleed out to death in front of all the women of the family. And then when it came turn for the women, they were actually burned at the stake. And at the time, these sort of punishments, these sort of methods were only reserved for people who committed crimes like treason. And the government decided that these crimes were so horrific that only these sorts of punishments were suitable enough for the family. Now, a lot of people don't actually know if this story is 100% true. It's become a big part of Scottish folklore. There's a lot of people that seem to believe this is 100% true, although there are no formal documents explaining whether it is or not. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think this is a true story? Do you think the Hills Have Eyes was actually based on this? Do you think that this is just a Scottish legend? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. And if you have any other case suggestions, I like hearing about obscure stories that we actually haven't seen across YouTube already a million times. So let me know in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video.